Thank you very much for inviting me to this extraordinary and beautiful building, and I'm really delighted to be with you. I've called this Britain and Africa a question of perspective because I think that it very much is a question of perspective and a question of deciding how you look at the problem. Sorry, my grasp of that was clearly not right. Because you can look at Africa in so many different ways, and it is there is by no means unanimity on how one should do that. As I say, I always think the first thing you need to remember is that Africa isn't a country. And if you look at the size of it, you can see there that you can fit in the whole of China, the whole of India, the United States, Mexico, and Europe. Just to give you an idea of the scale, we're talking about more than 50 countries, and almost anything that one is going to say, you can find an alternative which is in the opposite direction. I just think it's important to bear that in mind and not get carried away when we are talking about Africa. It is a massive continent, and one can only know a little bit about some bits of it. I defy anybody to say that they know Africa. What I'm going to try and look at is run through very quickly some kind of context, Britain as an imperial ruler, the question of colonialism and slavery, then look at some alternative perspectives before coming to the more present day, through the post-war, and finally looking at some future visions. There's only one man that can possibly begin in any discussion of Africa and Britain, and that is Cecil Rhodes, the man who bestrode the continent like no one else ever did. From Cape to Cairo, that was his aim of the railway system, and the things that he said about Britain and its role were quite extraordinary. I mean, he thought that actually the entire world should be under Britain, and in fact, including the United States. Why only Africa? I mean, he was also, one should not forget, that he was the man who founded the Anglo-American Company, which now also has as its successor Anglo Gold Ashanti, and of course De Beers. So any of you who are wearing gold rings or perhaps engagement diamonds, he's probably the man who was responsible for getting them for you. Perhaps not in all of them, but he certainly had a hand in doing that. An extraordinary figure. He was also responsible for the Boer War, which was one of the most savage colonial wars that Britain ever fought, and resulted in 500,000 troops being sent in to crush just 100,000 Boers. And when I say 100,000, I mean 100,000 that included women, children, grannies and grandpas. It was an extraordinary event. The other thing that we have to remember and never forget is, of course, slavery. I mean, the wealth of this island was certainly vastly contributed by the slave process. That is a picture of the brook, which was the iconic image of slavery. And one should never forget the 6 foot 1 inch that men had, 6 foot 1 inch by 1 foot 4, and 5 foot 10 by 1 foot 4 that women had. Children had even smaller spaces. But there is one other fact that one should never forget. Almost every single slave on that boat would have been enslaved by another African. Very few slaves were ever captured by British people or by whites. They were actually enslaved by other Africans. And that's an important thing to remember because it bears on the way in which we should look at Africa as a whole. This is just something, a very brief point about the alternatives where one can look at this. In 1888, a British frigate off the Horn of Africa came across 2 dhows, which were loaded down with more than 200 slaves off to be sold in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah. They were taken, they were freed, they were brought to Aden, and they ended up eventually in South Africa because they had a terrible time of it. This is one of the slaves. Her name was Bishu Jasa. And she went to Lovedale, which, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, has links with Scotland. It was a Scottish mission, and she was very well treated. Her entire history was brought down, and she was given training. She married a white man. She became a very educated woman. And extraordinarily, One of her descendants, her grandsons, was Neville Alexander, Dr. Neville Alexander, whom you may have heard of. He ended up on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela. He was a freedom fighter in South Africa, but a man who can trace his history back through slavery and back to Ethiopia. I just bring that up as a sort of indication of the complexity that there is in understanding the relationship between Britain and Africa. On the one hand, this terrible legacy of the slave relationship on which the wealth was built here. On the other hand, the fact that Britain also played a role in freeing many slaves, and as many naval officers died preventing slavery as ever died enforcing slavery. This is another figure which I think people, certainly in South Africa, have never forgotten, which is the 23,000 women and children that died in Boer War concentration camps. This is a child dying in, probably of cholera, in those camps. The camps were not designed to kill people, unlike German concentration camps. They were designed to concentrate the population. But if you want to know why the history of South Africa is the way it is, you have to understand the anger of the Afrikaner people at the treatment of their women and children. And every time that we raised issues of apartheid, they threw this back in our face. So one has to remember these things. All I'm trying to say by bringing these things up is the complexity of this relationship goes a long way. Here's something that's a mistake. Keir Hardie indeed was in Cape Town in 1909, but he wasn't going on his way to India. He'd just come from India. And there he is standing in Cape Town. You can see him in the white suit. It's not a very good photograph. Outside the Socialist Hall, a building which still stands. I raise this because there is also a depth of relationship between Scotland and the Scottish Labour Party and Scottish socialism and South Africa, and in fact in Africa as a whole. I mean, one can't talk about Malawi without remembering people like Livingstone, for example. When Keir Hardie went to South Africa, he in fact had to flee for his life. He called on people on the trade union movement, of which they had members in South Africa, to recognize the role of black as well as white men and women, and that they should organize everybody irrespective of race. He had to run from the hall, and that Union Jack that you see in the back of the room there is one that he ripped from the wall as he ran in Pretoria. He kept it to the end of his days. I'm now going to skip really fast forward to the post-war period and the decolonization process. And it is remarkable that this is such a recent event. When I started first working for the British Labour Party in 1984, in 1979, I still had papers which related to that independence process, and I was still being seen by people. People came to see the party and ask us for their advice on how to arrange parties and what we should do. So it is a really, recent event. This is not something that goes way, way back in the past. This is something that has been forgotten for many years now, which is the Bara Patrol. It was instituted in 1965 in order to try and break the hold of Ian Smith in Rhodesia. It was a sanctions campaign to block the oil that was going in through Mozambique to keep Rhodesia going. And in the end, of course, it failed, and in 1980 we had Robert Mugabe. But if one wants to understand the relationship with Zimbabwe, one should not forget this. One should also not forget what happened in 2000, when British troops went into Sierra Leone to overthrow the Revolutionary United Front and to stop them from taking Freetown, an event which was welcomed by almost universally by people of Sierra Leone. I'm bringing these up because I think it is important that one shouldn't just see the British relationship with Africa in one dimension. That is perhaps the best-known image, or which forms the way that we look at that relationship, which is the 84-85 famine. In fact, quite a lot of that was done as a publicity stunt. It certainly saved lives. But I wonder how many of you remember the pictures of Robert Maxwell getting off the plane personally and trying to deliver the aid. The editor of the Daily Mirror. It was an amazing event. This is the other thing that we have to remember, which is that the Cold War was fought across the whole of Africa. Here you see the Allies on both sides of the divide. And how many people now remember that Cuban forces were flown into Angola and Cuban forces were flown into Ethiopia? In fact, there was one period in Ethiopian history when a Soviet plane was landing at something like every hour to bring arms into there to prevent the Somalis, in fact, from coming in through the Ogaden. It was a very, very bitter war. But if you want to look at the divisions and the fractures that now exist in Africa, a lot of them go back to this period, and one should not forget them. But if that is the old division, there's another one that has arisen. And this is the relationship that now, what's called an arc of instability, going all the way from Somalia right across to Mauritania. And this is the activities of people like Al-Shabaab, the various Al-Qaeda affiliates who operate in there, whether it's in Chad, Niger, Mali, northern Nigeria, Boko Haram, and the deaths that are being caused there. I'm not saying that they are all related to that organization or to those organizations, but the division that is now ripping across Africa is a severe one, and if you want to understand the problems of Africa, that is one of the issues that has to be considered. The other one is the dotted line from South America. The cocaine trade, which ties up with the cigarette trade going through the Sahara, is absolutely vitally important. You cannot understand the politics of places like Guinea-Bissau, Equatorial Guinea, and those kind of places if you don't know what is happening, where the funds are going in order to make that happen. They are an integral part of that story, and you have to understand it if you want to know what is going on in Africa. But there is another side to this as well, which is much more hopeful. They are the remittances which are now going back from people who are living in this country, who have made their homes here and who have made their livings here. These are the largest number of nurses. There are something like 14,000, over 14,000. Have I got that right? Well, anyway, there are around 14,000 registered nurses in the UK. And no, absolutely not. I started at 5:02. I'm sorry, I'm going on to 5:15. And those are the registered nurses in the UK. They send back huge sums of money. The remittances in 2010 were $51 billion. This goes against an aid budget sent to the whole of Africa of $43 billion. This is in 2010. So remittances are now more important than aid is. And one should never forget that. Every time you see an African working in this country, they are an important part of the development process. Let me now just come to the concerns that we have if one wants to look at Africa. The first is Africa's growth, which was talked about a moment ago, and the Africa Rising perspective. Certainly true. 5% growth rate over the last decade across most of Africa, not just related to extractive countries, although they have the ones that have probably done best, but also associated with increasing inequality. A very good report came out, I think it was this week, which showed that there's increasing inequality in that relationship. The second one is that the poor leadership in Africa is appalling. And it is associated with many people who have hung on to power year after year. You would talk about the Nguemas in Equatorial Guinea, Bouteflika in Angola, Mugabe in Zimbabwe, Bouteflika in Algeria, Dos Santos in Angola. And it is not for nothing that the richest woman in Africa is the daughter of Dos Santos. Now, I'm sure she's a fine businesswoman, but the fact that she happens to be sitting on a pile of, on some of the richest oil fields in the continent should not go unremarked on. Finally, there are the inadequate institutions. It is an absolute tragedy that the African Union is so weak and that its security architecture has failed on so many occasions. You only have to look at what happened from Ivory Coast through to South Sudan today, and the structures which have been put in place over the last 10 years, in which hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent, have frankly failed to live up to what was required. It is a sad and, I'm afraid, not a good result. Having said all of that, there is certainly a much better story to be told. I think that there are genuinely determination, as I say, real African solutions to African problems, and where they will be based on is on young African people going back and building what they believe in their own countries. I've met them time and again. A lot of people who say, we're not interested in these politicians, we think a lot of them stink. Sorry, I don't mean to be rude to any politician here, but they really don't think much of their own politicians in Africa. Absolutely. But they are determined to really make a go of things, and a lot of them have brought back skills, expertise, and finance in order to do it. So I think that there is a very good story to be told there. But it also has to be a relationship between equals. And one of the things that we can do, if we are going to really make this relationship work, is to strengthen those organizations which have already been mentioned very briefly, like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and the Kimberley process, all of which are weak in themselves, but are the beginning of holding people to account. And one of the things that we have to be really, really critical of is the way in which the African Union has now begun to criticize the International Criminal Court. The fact that you have some of the worst killers in the world now sitting in people like Charles Taylor, frankly, who have blood on their hands from one end to the other, facing a trial in a due process, is absolutely marvelous. The only reason they're there is not because they're being picked on because they're Africans. It's because African courts have been unable to hold them to account. But the international global system is beginning to do that, and that is wonderful. The other thing that I would say is, and this really is much more your area, which is the question of the whole relationship between the extraction of resources. I saw this very, very powerfully in eastern Congo when I went to Mongwalu, where you actually saw, tragically, gold being taken out of eastern Congo illegally. In some cases, I actually recorded collusion with the United Nations. You had troops who were supposed to be preventing it, colluding with some of the worst of the rebel movements and bringing it out and selling it off. Tons of Congolese gold and other key minerals have been extracted in that way, and that cannot be allowed to happen. And I said I would end on Cecil Rhodes and his companies. I would just like to read to you finally from a report by Human Rights Watch called "The Curse of Gold in the Democratic Republic of Congo." It relates to 2003. It says, AngloGold Ashanti, one of the largest gold producers in the world, started exploration activities in the Mongwalu mining area. Following earlier attempts to make contact with one of the armed groups, AngloGold Ashanti representatives established relations with the FNI, an armed group responsible for serious human rights abuses, including war crimes and crimes against humanity, and who controlled the Mongwalu area. In return for FNI assistance, for security for its operations and staff, AngloGold Ashanti provided logistical and financial support. That, in turn, resulted in political benefits to the armed group and its leaders. The company knew, or should have known, that the FNI armed group had committed grave human rights abuses against civilians and was a party, and not a party, to the transitional government. This is the sort of thing that we are responsible for. These companies are registered in Britain. We must hold them to account. This is the sort of operation that cannot be allowed to think. And if there's something that we can do for Africa, Africa is doing plenty for itself, but we must play our role as well. Thank you.